So in this video, we're going to look at the new features added in Rig-GNS 4.3. Most of the updates were done on the Simuquick tab, which is now in version 2.0. Now to demonstrate the new features, I'll start from DAZ Studio, where I already have a Genesis H female loaded up with a skirt for the simulation. Now I'll go ahead and export the figure, and then switch over to Blender and import it using Rig-GNS. Next, I will rig the figure using the buttons in the Rig-O-Matic tab. Alright, with that done, I'll quickly change the viewport shading to matte cap and also enable textures so we get some colors in the figure. Before looking at the Simuquick tab, let's first add an animation. Now to do that, I'll open the Animixer tab, click Import Motion, choose FBX, and then locate the animation file. Here's an animation I downloaded from ActorCore, so I'll import that and then click bind and play the animation. Now you can see the sketch is not deforming the way it should. It looks stiff, almost like it's made of cardboard instead of fabric, and this is exactly what the Simuquick tab is designed to fix. Alright, this part of the video was added during post-production to point out something I noticed while editing the tutorial. It is something I completely missed during the original recording. So when the animation plays, you'll notice a strange twisting around the shoulder. The shoulder area shows an unusual deformation, and I continued the entire recording without realizing it. This happened because I had been experimenting with the rig settings. Now I'm going into pose mode. The issue is happening with the twig spine bone, and this is because in the bone properties under relationship, the inherit option was disabled, and this is what caused the twisting you see here. Once I enable it back on, you can see the deformation is fixed. This is not an issue with the add-on, and it is not something you need to worry about. It only happened because of a temporary rig settings I changed while testing. So with that clarified, let's continue with the tutorial. Now before we start setting up the simulation, I'll need to pick the animation so it becomes part of this blend file. So I'll go here and click the big button. Alright. I noticed an issue with the animation. The hands are intersecting a bit with the body. So I'm going to make a quick adjustment by expanding the Adjustments tab, then tilt the shoulder slightly, and also adjust the upper arm a bit so the hand moves away from the body. Okay, that already looks better. Now in the Action tab, I'm going to unassign the baked animation from the rig, then click Reset. Next, I'll select the skirt. And before we continue, I'll collapse some of these panels so we have the Simuquick tab clearly in view. Now in the Simuquick tab, you'll notice there's a new button called Mark Edges. To show you how this works, I'll zoom in on the skirt and switch to edit mode. What we need here is to have a chain of edges selected, and the way to do that is by double clicking on a vertical edge, which will loop select the entire chain of connected edges. I usually like to do this in front view, so I'll press 1 on the numpad. I think I'll go with this loop instead. So with those edges selected, we can now click the Mark Edges button. As soon as I do that, you can see the edges turn purple. These marked edges are simply guides for the simulation bone chains, which we'll see in a moment. Now I'll do the same thing on the other side of the skirt. I'll select a similar vertical loop on the right side and then click Mark Edges again. So here on the panel, you'll notice there are 2 more buttons next to the Mark Edges button. The first one clears the marking on the current selection. For example, when I select a loop that has already been marked and I decide I don't want to use it anymore, I can just double click to select that edge loop again and then click this button, and the marking will be removed from those edges. So if you have several edge chains marked and you want to start over, you can then click this button to have all the marked edges cleared. Alright, now I'll continue marking the rest of the edge chains that I need for the simulation. I'll switch to the back and continue marking. This is actually one of those cases where symmetry marking will be useful. So that's something I plan to add in future versions to make the process faster. Okay, I'll switch to side view and keep marking the loops. Okay, notice what happens here. I have a loop selected very close to another loop that is already marked, and when I click mark edges, I get a warning saying selection intersects or is adjacent to an existing path. What this means is that Simuquick does not allow two marked loops to sit right next to each other. There needs to be some spacing between the chains so the simulation bones don't overlap. So in this case, if I want to use this loop instead, I first need to clear the loop that's already marked. Once I remove that marking, I can now mark this one without any warning. Alright, now for the last side, I'll mark this loop here, and then this one, and finally this one as well. Alright, now that we have all the markings on the skirt, we can then go to the panel and click the Create Bones button. As soon as we do that, a menu pops up with a few options. We have an option here that reads Bone Count. This allows us to decide how many bones will be created along each marked chain. 3 bones can work, but I usually prefer a higher number so that the cloth has more flexibility during the simulation. So in this case, I'll set it to 7. For this collision mesh option, it's important to leave this enabled if we want the skirt to properly interact with the figure during the simulation. Now for the parent bone option, the add-on already suggested the hip bone, which is the correct choice in this case since it makes sense to anchor the skirt around the waist, which is where the hip bone is located. Now with those settings configured, I'll go ahead and click OK. And once that is done, you can see the simulation bones are now created. Now I'll go back to the Action tab, reassign the baked animation, and play the animation again. Okay, you can see the skirt now deforms much better than before. It's not perfect yet, but the movement already looks more realistic. You'll notice that the skirt is not fully deforming to the simulation bones, and that is because some of the rig bones, like the pelvis bone, the thigh and shin bones, are still influencing the skirt, which prevent the cloth from moving with the simulation bones. Now to give the simulation bones full control, we'll first need to select the skirt, then come over to this button here in the Simuquick tab. You can see the description says Deform bones influence simulation. The original deform bones from the rig, like the thigh and shin, will continue to affect the mesh along with the simulation bones. Now disabling it makes the skirt controlled solely by the simulation bones with no influence from the thigh or the shin bones. You can see the skirt now follows the simulation bones much more cleanly, and the result already looks better than before. Okay, now let's look at some of the additional options available in the Simuquick tab. We have this strength field, which can be used to control how firm or loose the simulation behaves. Now before adjusting them, let's look at this button here called the Isolate Physics Objects. When I click it, you can see that only the physics object responsible for the simulation remain visible. Here we have the simulated mesh, which is what actually drives the simulation bones, and this other object here is the collision mesh generated from the figure, and it is used so the simulation mesh can properly collide with the body during the animation. Okay, so I'll pause the animation for now so we can look at the strength settings. In the strength field, the weight value is set to 0.1 and the percentage is set to 10%. So right now, the lower part of this skirt has a weight value of 0.1, which makes it loose and flexible rather than rigid. Now when I increase the percentage value, you can see the larger portion of the mesh is assigned that 0.1 weight value. In other words, more of the skirt become loose with more freedom to move. And you can see when I reduce the percentage value, less of the mesh uses that weight value. Now if we want the skirt to be stiffer, we can begin with a higher weight value such as 0.5, and we can still increase the percentage so that more of the mesh uses that value. But in most cases, keeping the weight value around 0.1 or even close to 0 and setting the percentage to around 10% usually gives a good result for a cloth like this. We can also make small adjustments to the weight using the arrow here, which makes it easier to fine-tune the stiffness without typing new values each time. I'll click the Isolate Physics Object button again to return to the normal view. Now I'm playing the animation and increasing the weight value. You can see the skirt becomes much stiffer and the movement starts to look unnatural. So I'll bring the weight value back down to 0. Alright, now below the strength settings, we now have this new option called Slack Level. This is a new feature added in this version and it controls how loose the cloth sits on the character. Now when I increase the slack level to 0.5, when the character spins, you can see the skirt spread out more naturally instead of staying glued to the legs. So the slack level is useful when you want the cloth to feel less tight and more relaxed during simulation. Now with that slack level increased, you can see in some of the frames the figure starts poking through the skirt. This is where the shrink wrap option becomes useful. Now when I enable it, the skirt is forced to stay closer to the surface of the body, especially around the thigh, which helps prevent the mesh from intersecting with the figure. Now I'll play the animation again, and let's go back to the beginning so we can see it clearly. Well, the result is not perfect, but it already looks much better with the shrink wrap enabled, since the poking issue has been reduced a lot. Of course, if you have the time, you can always go to the frames where the mesh is poking, switch to pose mode, and manually adjust some of the simulation bones to improve the result. We'll look at refining the simulation in pose mode in a separate video. For now, I'll just reduce the slack level to about 0.2, which should tighten the skirt slightly and reduce the intersections. That already looks much better, and we no longer have those poking issues. So now let's look at the rest of the buttons in the Simuquick tab. Here we have the clear bones button. Now when you click this button, all the simulation bones that we have created for the cloth will be removed, which lets us start over if you want to build a new setup from scratch. Next, we have the transfer cloth button. This is useful when you want to use the different clothing items on the same character without having to rig the figure again. For example, you can go back to DAZ Studio, load a different outfit on the same figure, export it, then import it into the scene, and then use the transfer clothes to fit the new clothing to the already rigged character. So we've already seen what the isolate physics object button does. Now this other button here is for editing the same mesh directly in edit mode. So if for some reason you need to tweak the geometry, fix the topology, or change the shape slightly, you can use this button to access the mesh without breaking the simulation setup. Now here we have the collide with collision mesh button. Let me disable this for a moment so we can see what it does. Now when I play the animation, you can see the skirt is no longer respecting the collision mesh, so the clothes start passing through the body. The only reason the skirt is still trying to stay above the figure is because the shrink wrap option is still enabled. Now when I disable the shrink wrap as well, you can see the skirt completely ignores the body since there is no collision applied anymore. Now when I enable the collide option again, the skirt starts interacting with the figure properly. Even with the shrink wrap still off, the collision alone already helps keep the cloth from passing through the body. Now I'll turn the shrink wrap back on. Now let's look at the bake Simu button down here. I'll pause the animation first, then click bake Simu. This opens a menu where we can choose the frame range we want to bake. And we also have this option called finalize bake. When this option is enabled, the add-on will remove the helper objects that are used internally for the simulation. When we look at the outliner, you can see those helper objects here. You'll notice several empties, and these empties are what actually drives the simulation bones during playback. So let's go ahead and break this simulation. I will leave the finalize option disabled for now, and then click OK. This may take a moment depending on the length of the animation. Alright, the bake is finished. Now what this means is that the motion from the simulation has now been written directly into the bones, and the skirt is no longer being driven by the simulation mesh or the empties in the background. So at this point, the movement is coming purely from the action, with real bone animations controlling the skirt. Now you can also see we now have this option to unbake, so this is non-destructive. This allows us to go back to the simulation setup if we want to run the cloth simulation again. But if you know you only need the simulation for this one action and you are satisfied with the result, then when baking, you can then enable the finalize option. The add-on will remove all the helper meshes, empties, and simulation objects after the bake, leaving only the final bone animation. So it is meant for when you are sure that the result is final. Now, if we play the animation again from the beginning, you can see the skirt animation looks much better compared to how it looked when the figure was first imported from DAZ. Alright, so that is it for this video. I hope you found this video useful and found this new update helpful. If you do, please don't forget to like the video, share with friends, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for your time. I'll see you next time.